Hello, I'm Catherine from Crystal Pegasus Costumes, and welcome to this video, which is all about how I made this corset. I used Redthreaded's 1860s Gored corset pattern, and I have a separate video about my mock-up process where I adapted the pattern to fit me. And so without further ado, let's get sewing.
Here are all the pattern pieces as I got to in the fitting video. When I take away the Gore pieces, the ones left will be silk fused to coutil. The Gore pieces will all be quilted, which we'll look at soon. First, let's prepare the fused pieces. 3 layers were used. Firstly, a white small weave herringbone coutil, a red silk satin, which I was fortunate enough to buy most of a bolt as a remnant, and bonderweb, a double-sided iron-on fusible interfacing to join the two fabrics together. I laid out the silk, wrong side up, then the bonderweb. I trimmed down the silk, leaving overhang at all edges, and pinned the layers together. I used the iron to fuse the 2 layers together, working outwards from the centre and doing a small part at a time. It was a slow process, but the outcome is worth it. I peeled off the bonderweb backing paper. Then I laid out the coutil, laid over the silk, right side up this time, so the fusible layer is towards the coutil. Then I smoothed and pinned as before. Back to the ironing board, where I fused the silk to the coutil. Then I was ready to cut out my pieces. I laid out the pattern pieces, aligning the grain and pinning at both ends of the grain line. Then weighing down. I cut out the pieces with my rotary cutter, using a ruler for the straight edges and freehanding the curved edges. I repeated the process for the rest of the pieces. I transferred the gore and bone channel markings onto the inside of the pieces. And the fused pieces were prepared. For the hip and bust gores, I created a quilted textile using coutil, 2 layers of bamboo cotton batting, cotton sateen, and silk. I smoothed and weighed down the layers, then pinned around the edges. Firstly, I stitched along the top edge, using a walking foot to secure the layers together. I laid my ruler at the desired angle for my quilting, and I tacked on a guideline for me to follow for my stitching. I kept the fabric as flat as I could and stitched along next to the guideline. Then I stitched another line 2 centimeters over and parallel to the first, and repeated for each line. Once I had done from the middle to the right, I did the same the other way and moved from the middle 2 centimeters to the left each time. There was a decided difference between the two halves, so I decided to work from one corner over for the second direction of stitching, as much as I could, and tacked down my next guideline. Then I stitched the second direction of the quilting, and my quilted textile was complete. Walking foot for the win. I pinned down my pieces, aligned the grain, and traced around them. I stitched just inside the lines I had drawn, we can see it from the front and from the back. Then I cut out the quilted pieces along the drawn lines. To be able to bind the edges, I cut bias strips of silk. My next step was to bind the edges of the gores and facing pieces which will be visible on the inside of the finished corset. For the gores, I sewed the binding to the wrong side, as that's where the edge will be visible. The silk had a tendency to fray, so I decided to overlock the quilted edges that were not bound or not going to be sewn. I ironed the back lacing panels in half and stitched along the bust gore line on the front panels. And with that, all the pieces were prepared and I was ready to start assembly. It was time to insert the busk, and I started pin's side first. I stitched the facing to the front piece along the centre front line as marked on the facing piece. I pressed the seam allowance towards the facing piece and then top stitched. I pressed the front piece so that the centre front lines matched up and the placket was created. Then I stitched in the ditch along the centre front line. Time to bring in the busk. Taking the pin side, I marked the top and bottom of the busk and the location of each pin. I used an awl to create the holes which I inserted the pins through. Pausing on the pins, it was time to start the loop side. I pinned the front to the facing, aligning the centre front line. I marked the top and bottom of the busk, and then the location of each loop. I stitched along the centre front line, raising the needle and skipping over the areas where the loops need to pass out. I pressed the seam open, then top stitched along the facing side and pressed the seam closed. I inserted the loops and tested that it could attach smoothly to the pins, which it could. I used a bone to pull the loops through while I stitched the busk in. Using a zipper foot, I stitched right next to the busk on both the front pieces. Hurrah! The busk was inserted. It was time to insert the bust gores. First, I cut down the centre of the gore opening. Then I warmed it up with the iron and pressed it open along the sewn fold lines with my fingers. I pinned the bust gore into place, starting at the very bottom to set that position first. Then pinning up each side, easing it around and ensuring that the edge sits 10 millimeters from the edge of the gore. Next, I pinned the second side. I top stitched the gore into place. I trimmed down the folded in coutil. Then I stitched a second line around the gore, securing the raw edges underneath. I repeated this process for the second gore and the other half of the corset. It was time to add those bone channels which do not go over the hip gore, starting with the side back pieces. I stuck pins through to mark the line of the bone channel onto the right side of the fabric. Then on the wrong side, I laid a 20mm wide herringbone tape along the line and used masking tape to hold it in position. I stitched down the centre of the bone channel along the pinned line, as this was a double boning channel. I removed the masking tape, then I stitched 8mm either side of the centre line, and the double bone channel was sewn. Then the bone channels on the front pieces were done in the same way. The line was pinned through to the front, and the herringbone tape was held in place with masking tape. I stitched down the middle of the double bone channel, then removed the masking tape. I switched to the zipper foot, folded the bust gore out of the way, and stitched 8mm from the middle on either side. Then the same process was repeated for the other bone channels on the front pieces, which were all the bone channels I needed to sew at that point. I pinned the front to the side, then stitched, pressed the seam towards the front, and top stitched to secure. I trimmed down the top layer of the seam allowance, and I was ready to attach the hip gores. I pinned the hip gore to the main piece of the corset, starting at the balance marks and moving my way out. I stitched the two pieces together, then stitched on a piece of bias binding because I wanted to minimise the bulk of the quilting and finish the edge. I trimmed down the seam allowance of the quilted hip gore and clipped the fused coutil layer. I folded over the bias binding and pinned that down. I top stitched with a white upper thread, red lower thread. Then I did a second line of stitching and even a third to really hold that seam allowance down. It's not perfect, but I was happy to try new things. Time to finish the assembly. I stitched a bone channel parallel to the busk, top stitching through the two layers. I top stitched along the centre back edge of the back panel, then I pinned the back to the rest of the corset and stitched with a 15mm seam allowance. I pressed the seam towards the back and top stitched. Then trimmed down the seam allowance. Next came the bone and grommet channels at the back. I stitched in the ditch along the seam on the back panel and then 12mm in, creating another bone channel. At this point, all the pieces were assembled, which is an exciting part of any project. It was time to insert the flat steel bones either side of the grommets and next to the busk. Then the synthetic whalebones into the bone channels I had so far. I had shaped the ends to match the bone channels where needed. Grommets next. I marked the grommet locations and cut holes with my prim pliers. I inserted the grommets in my normal manner, using the prim pliers, 2-part grommets, widening the hole with an awl, pushing the first part through. Second part goes on next, and then give it a big squeeze with the prim pliers. And a grommet is done. Here we can see the back and the front. And then I added in the laces, almost ready for my first fitting of the corset. The final step in preparation was to tape in the remaining bones, leaving them free over the hips.
So here we are, the first try on. The purpose of this is to pinpoint the location for the bone channels over the hip gores. So that's why it's all quite lumpy down there. As you just saw, these are taped on, and so we need to work out where they're going. I think I'm pretty happy with the bottom of the corset. And using the line that was planned, we'll get these bone channels in, trim it off and bind the bottom. I'm less thrilled with the top, but my thought is let's get the bottom sorted first, and then we'll turn our attention up to here.
I gave the bones a wiggle to check they were sitting where they wanted to, then marked the locations with pins. I compared the two sides and evened up the placements, then marked the location of the bone channels over the hip gores, and transferred the bone channel lines to the outside with pins in the same way I had earlier. I laid on the herringbone tape, and as these were single bone channels, not double, I could only tape one side and used a few pins to hold the other. I stitched the first side of the bone channel, keeping the edge of the foot following the pinned centre line. I removed the bones and masking tape, then I stitched the second side of the bone channel. To finish these single bone channels, I stitched again either side, creating double lines of stitching. As well as the look, this had the benefit of catching down the tape. Did the same for the rest of the side bone channels. Then inserted the bones. After a quick try on to confirm I was happy with the progress, I was ready to bind the bottom edge. I trimmed down the bottom edge. I attached a strip of bias, right sides together, and stitching with red thread. I pressed the bias binding down. Then I folded it over and pinned it in place. I stitched in the ditch. And after a press, I had a nice neat binding on the bottom edge. It was time for the next fitting. I was very happy with the lower half of the corset and the bottom edge, and how most of the top was sitting, but I decided that the apex of the bust needed to come in just a little. I carefully unpicked the top 6 centimeters of each gore at the bust apex, and tied that off underneath, burying the threads. I moved the edges of the gores in so that they were touching, and pinned into position. I re-stitched the gores down, and then tied off and buried the threads. The stitching was a bit wobbly, but at least it was done. As I did when binding the bottom edge, I trimmed the top edge down, stitched on a strip of bias binding, which I folded and pinned down, and then stitched in the ditch. At this point, my corset was fully structurally assembled. After considering a few options of decorative lace, I decided on a white cotton lace with ribbon trim, and after a few trials, I settled on a yellow silk ribbon. I pinned on my lace, then stitched it down along the top and middle and bottom. The next decorative element was the flossing. I tried a few options on a flossing sampler and determined that I wanted to use De Vere yarns size 36 silk, number 1 white, 101 blanc, 68 banana, and 90 ingot, coming together to form a little gradient. Then onto the flossing on the corset. For greater detail on flossing technique, please see my flossing videos. I created a gradient from light to dark, carefully counting stitches and spacing it out. All the ends of the threads were buried, keeping the back nice and neat. I was very happy with how the flossing came out and thought it added a certain something special. I also decorated the base of the bust gores, which had the benefit of securing them nicely. The final piece of functional decoration was the arrow hook for holding down petticoats. With it in place, the corset was complete.
So here we are, my completed 1860s Gored corset. Overall, I'm absolutely thrilled with it. I think it came up really well. I'm pretty happy with the fit, although it's not completely perfect along the top line. There's a bit of space there, but for the moment, I think that's nothing that a roughly corset cover can't hide. I am particularly pleased with the quilting and the flossing and the lace. I think those are details that really make this corset. Plus the va-va-voom shape, of course. I do feel really comfortable and supported. The waist is sitting nicely, and then there's the support from the corset under the bust and the chemise at the top. So overall, I am very happy and excited to get on with more 1860s garments. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you'll join me again next time. Goodbye.